Hello, everybody, and welcome back to UXChange, the podcast where I exchange my user experiences to change them, and yours for the better. I'm Jeremy, a mentor and senior user researcher with over 8 years of experience and a background in neuroscience. Throughout my career, I've had the privilege of engaging with hundreds of users around the world, spanning across Europe, the USA, Africa, and India. This has allowed me to deliver actionable insights that have improved user experiences with nutrition, automotive, delivery, and e-commerce sectors. I've created this podcast with the aim of providing my mentorship and educational content, offering actionable tips, knowledge, and guidance in the realm of research, specifically focusing on UX research to anyone having an interest in this area. And I hope that you will find this episode insightful. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the show. Very happy to be back, and today we will cover this third episode of this 3 episode series dedicated to mental models. If you haven't done it yet, I will give you a brief summary on the first and on the second episode. In the first episode, I covered why it is so important to address mental models in user experience. In the end, that's the very base of any design, because it's the iceberg in itself, below the tip of the iceberg. I also covered what are mental models, which is, in a nutshell, expectations a user has about how a product, a service, an app, anything would work based on past experiences. And as such, is based on memories, past experiences. And so as such, it's not particularly representative of the truth. And so then it leads to mismatches sometimes when you develop a product or you design something. And if you want to be a little bit more geared towards disruptive innovation, you might not have any existing mental model in your users that is matching with what you're designing. So as such, you might need to solve some mental model mismatches. So I address this topic by saying 2 ways of doing so. First one is to educate your users. That is the one that is the less described, at least when we refer to mental models in general. That is the one that is less described. In general, people cover more the aspect of making your product matching your users' mental models, and that's very fair, because that's the rationale behind UX design in general. We must conform and answer our users' needs, but it might not be always the case. Sometimes we might educate them. So that's the first step, educating our users. Then in the second step, or way to tackle this mental model mismatch, we have making this product matching your users' mental models, and that's oftentimes what we do. And then I covered the aspect of how do mental models develop over time, and of course this is due to accumulation of memories, experiences, and so on. In the second episode, I covered topics such as why mental models are essential for innovation, how to create and use mental model mapping. And so I covered different kinds of maps, saying, of course, if you should remember only one thing from this second episode, it would be that there is no one hard rule about how to represent a mental model or any mind mapping whatsoever. The rule is really to make some maps to connect the dots and to represent your information in a way that makes sense to you and your stakeholders. And so mental model mapping is part of this process, right? But then I covered the idea of cognitive maps as they are described by Nielsen Norman Group, and they say that this is a broad and umbrella term to refer to mapping in general, mapping ideas and representing them as an ecosystem, let's say. And so inside of that, you have the cognitive maps, you have the mind maps, you have the concept maps, and so on and so forth. So I covered all of that, and I give you some tricks on how you should represent them. And this is applicable not only to UX research, but also UX designers, product managers, and anyone who wants really to develop a product. So it can be startup founders and the like. So I hope that really this kind of content is at least useful in one way to you, that you learn at least one thing. And so I want to expand on that, and I want to give a small announcement. You might not have seen, but in the show notes, I included the link to my Instagram. And so they will be now following each episode. And maybe between episodes and maybe before episodes, there will be some posts about the episodes, encouraging reflection. It's not easy to discuss on the podcasts in the podcast platforms themselves. That is a UX improvement that could be made. And so as such, I found that probably Instagram could be a good way. So let's see if also people like it, and if they don't, probably I will switch to something else. And I'm about also to launch a newsletter, so you can subscribe to be notified when new episodes are coming, to have some reflection bits about these episodes, and also getting once a week my thoughts about how to improve step by step your UX research process and your UX design process. I do not claim to be an expert. Yes, I have 10 years of experience, but we are all learning when we are in the UX world and in the product design world. And my ambition is not to be an expert. It's really just to share what I know, and to have some thoughtful conversations with people who may want to share as well what they know. So that is it for the announcements. Now I'm going to cover the third episode of this series. So this episode will be dedicated to how you can identify mental models in UX research. So you can employ several kinds of techniques for that. As I said at the beginning, I really want you to get clear in your mind that card sorting and tree testing, although they are, of course, the stars of the methodologies you can use, they are not by any way the only ones. And by the way, I think it's kind of a reduction to say that card sorting and tree testing are the only methodologies you can use to improve, to identify a mental model and correct any correct your design, correct your information architecture. Yes, you can do it, but it's not the only one. As everything in UX research and UX design and product design, everything is about approaching a problem from as many angles as possible. So in UX research, we use the term triangulation. Triangulation is the fact of employing various methodologies and various sources of information to reduce the complexity or reduce the uncertainty you have about a problem. So for instance, if I want to understand why people are dropping out of my website, maybe I want to use some analytics. That tells me how many people are doing XYZ behavior, but that's one part of the problem. I don't have the why. I don't have the why they're dropping out. Maybe it's because the flow is complex. Maybe it's because they're not finding what they want. Maybe it's just because, I don't know, they have to scroll a lot and they're getting distracted and anything. And so that is something that I could gather through user interviews. It can also be that probably they would tell me something, but probably they do not say everything they're doing. So maybe I would need to observe them and then ask them about what they did. So this is an observation. So you can already imagine that thanks to 3 methodologies, we are identifying insights. And sometimes insights, great insights, not sometimes, every time, are at the intersection of the use of these various methodologies. So for mental models, I would say, like pretty much anything else, I would say you could use user interviews, You could use contextual inquiry, ask your people to think out loud. You could use card sorting, surveys as well. Surveys could be used to confirm that you're on the right track when it comes to mental models. You could say something like, what do you expect to find category XYZ? And then you would give some multiple choice type of question. You could also say, where would you head to if you would like to do XYZ? Of course, it could be a tree test, but it could also be done in a survey to confirm using another methodology. And so the point here being that you have various techniques, and of course now we'll focus on the main ones, which are card sorting and tree testing. First of all, I want to describe you what is the position of these UX research methodologies in the landscape of UX research methods. Of course, I will make an episode dedicated to how you can choose a UX research methodology based on several criteria. But in a nutshell, you have qualitative research methodologies. To be really accurate with the words, you have methodologies that will allow you to gather qualitative data, and you have methodologies that will allow you to gather quantitative data. And then you have methodologies that will help you gather behavioral data and attitudinal data. It's difficult to represent, but you can imagine this as a 2x2 axis, if that's the word, and you can divide that space into 4 quadrants. Anyway, so for me, the tree testing is a behavioral methodology because it will allow you to understand what your users are doing. And it can be, qualitative or quantitative, depending on how you do it. You can moderate it. In this case, it will be qualitative because you will ask them questions. What were you doing at this step and why? What were you expecting to find there and why? Or it can be quantitative. It can be unmoderated. You ask them, and even if it's unmoderated, I always like to ask them questions along the way. But oftentimes, if we do things unmoderated, we would avoid to ask too many open-ended questions. In this case, it will be quantitative or qualitative, as I said, depending on the setup, and then behavioral because we observe them doing what they're doing. And it's the same for card sorting, kind of, let's say. For me, card sorting is really at the intersection. That's why it's a super, super interesting methodology, and probably that's why we say that it allows us to capture the mental models, because you can observe them sorting their cards. Clearly, you can observe them and taking notes. Okay, first, this card was put in under this category, but then the participant moved it. That's really interesting to have in mind, first of all. But then you can also gather their feedback, and so it will be behavioral but also attitudinal. They can tell you, I was thinking about this card to put it here, but for me it evokes me the idea of XYZ, so probably will go better here, so you would gather some feedback. And then you can also gather some qualitative data by just observing more or less the trends of how they sort information. And quantitative, you could also gather some statistics about your card sorting, like what is the percentage of cards that were grouped together and what is the number of times these two cards were grouped together. You can make some really, let's say, I would say some badass statistics by using dendrograms, looking at, let's say, the moment in the dendrogram where you should divide your categories with the best accuracy, let's say. I don't know if that makes sense, but the idea is that it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, it can be behavioral, it can be attitudinal. Depends on the way you do it, basically. Whereas other methodologies, they are more geared towards one type of methodology than another. For instance, eye tracking, you are more observing where your people are looking at. A/B testing is the same. You're just quantifying how many users um, did something versus another. Like how many people converted based on a change in design, basically. Analytics is exactly the same. User interviews is more, of course, as well. Qualitative and attitudinal, what they say. So that's why tree testing and card sorting are so interesting in identifying mental models. But again, they are not the only methodologies. I hope that by now you understood the idea, and I don't want to be too redundant, so I will stop here with the idea that they're not the only ones. Okay, so in a nutshell, you have card sorting and tree testing. Let's cover now card sorting. Card sorting, you have different types of card sorting, of course. You have the open card sorting, closed one, and the hybrid. Okay, what are the benefits of each one and when should you use them? I'm about to develop this now. The open card sorting is basically the fact of asking people to categorize things into, well, categories, but they are free to name their categories, they are free to create their categories. So that's really open in essence. And that is great if you don't know the first level of architecture of your website. Imagine you want to make a personal website and you don't know what you should put. Well, in this case, I would tell you don't do card sorting, to be honest. Go straight, develop your website, and then ask for feedback. But anyway, if you do an e-commerce website and you want to know how you should organize your products, so maybe you would have a main navigation bar, but you don't know how you should organize it. So probably you could do an open card sort first. That's the main recommendation. When you don't know what are the first categories, make an open card sort and do it moderated. And because you will see what are the first level categories. Once you have that, I would move to a closed card sort to be able to identify the deeper level connections. And so you identify your first categories. Imagine men, women on a website, and then it would be sport, casual, and so on and so forth. If for the first card sort you identify that the two categories are men and women, for instance, then in the second closed card sort, you can impose these two categories. That's what a closed card sort is. You impose the categories, the first level ones, and you ask people to put cards inside of them. And then you have a whole bunch of statistics you can make and analysis you can make to make sure that these two categories are the right ones. Because a closed card sort is a way for you first to validate that the first two categories are the right one. Well, first X categories are the right ones, and then to expand on that. If you're not sure about potential added new other categories at the first level, I would encourage to do a hybrid card sort. So hybrid refers to the fact that you have imposed categories. They can or cannot, if they want or don't want, put cards inside of them, but they can also create their categories. That's why it's so interesting. So in general, I would do open and then followed by hybrid and then followed by card sort. And if I add into the mix this idea of moderated and unmoderated, just imagine that the more you are, let's say, unclear about the information architecture, the more you are tilted towards moderation. And once you get closer every time to the definition of your information architecture, you would use unmoderated with a higher amount of participants, because your goal is to quantify. Your goal is not to have words to explain what people did. Your goal is really to count the number of people that did something, because you want to validate. It's just a yes/no question. Is our information architecture clear? Yes, no. Okay, let me count. If on 70 participants, well, the minimum amount of participants for a card sort unmoderated would be more something like 20 or 30, it's okay. But imagine, if out of 70 participants, I have 60 who put them into these two categories we defined, then we are good to go. So that's it. And so that's why you would do unmoderated in this case. So I would do open card sort, moderated, probably you could move to if you really have all the time and money in the world, which is never the case, but imagine in a perfect world, you would move to open card sort unmoderated. Then you would move to hybrid card sort moderated, hybrid card sort unmoderated, closed card sort moderated, and closed card sort unmoderated. Sorry, I really hope I did not overwhelm you. Hopefully that helps. Again, this is in a perfect world. We never ever do that. And so there are some benefits and some drawbacks associated to card sorting. One main drawback that I can see is the fact that in general, in the tools we use that are unmoderated, it doesn't mean that you cannot bend a bit the rules. We cannot ask participants to create subcategories. And this is something that would be really useful. A lot of the times I have participants telling me, oh, we can only create main categories that are all at the same level, but maybe they already have in mind the architecture that would be great for them. Maybe they know that they can be man, women, and then under man and women, or children, whatever, and under man and women they would have a sport, trendy, casual. Maybe they already know that. But the tools that we have nowadays, to my knowledge, I know a bunch of them: user testing, user zoom, which is kind of the same, I would agree, Discount, for instance, or other tools. I don't remember all of them, but Maze, for instance. To my knowledge, maybe these things changed recently, but last time I checked, we couldn't make subcategories. So if you're one of these people working at these companies, please hear me out. So that's the thing. But really, this is really useful to define an information architecture. And then you would have tree testing. Tree testing is when you want to validate an information architecture. So think of tree testing as when you already defined your information architecture. And you can imagine it at various levels. So you can imagine following up an open card sort with a tree test with only your first level categories. And then after your first level categories, you have a bunch of cards. I wouldn't do it. I would really do tree testing once things are really, really defined. But as I said, as sometimes in the tools we use, we don't have the ability to ask participants to create subcategories, then sometimes it might be useful to use a tree test while you're designing. So anyway, tree testing. Tree testing is a way to validate your information architecture. And so how would it happen? You would just submit your participants with an information architecture. So it's basically a UI, but the UI is simply a menu. It's nothing fancy. Imagine that more or less as the websites of the 90s, I would say. Nothing fancy. And you ask them to find information inside of this navigational structure. Of course, you respect all the rules of a traditional usability test, not mentioning any word that is in your tree because it will highly bias the results. Craft your questions so that they are mapped on a user end goal or job to be done, and not just click here, click there, or find this, find that. Give them a scenario so that they have context and they know where they know more or less what is their role here. And basically then you ask them to find the content and you observe where they click. And then you can derive a lot of insights from these two methodologies. From tree testing, I would analyze first clicks, indirect successes, direct successes, paths that they took, abandonments, and so on. And I would build some tables with statistics and some graphs to identify which are the paths that are highly unclear, and then you can derive a lot of how would I put it, conclusions from analyzing these results. So it can be when a lot of people headed somewhere to find something, but it was not there, it means probably it should be moved. This kind of conclusions that you can bring depending on the analysis of your results. Same as for card sorting. And I will make actually another episode dedicated to how to analyze your tree testing and your card sorting data. That would be it for today's episode. I hope that you learned at least one thing. If that's the case, again, I would be really grateful if you can just subscribe to the show so that you know when episodes are coming out. Leave a review, leave comments, head out to my Instagram to be notified and to, well, kickstart the conversation. Subscribe to the newsletter if it interests you. And I really thank you for tuning in every time, for the support, for the fact that you reach out for mentorship sessions. It's really, really a pleasure and an honor. And take care. See you in the next episode. Bye-bye. And that's it for today's episode. Thank you everyone for joining me today on UXChange. I hope you found today's episode insightful and valuable. Make sure to subscribe in order for you not to miss the next episode. Share it if you liked it and leave a review. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future topics, feel free to reach out directly to me. You can find all the details in the show notes. And see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.